At the outset, on my personal behalf and on behalf of the team, I welcome you to this introductory session of the lecture series on fluid inclusions in minerals. This is a little different type of a lecture series in the sense that it will not be based on any particular subject, but it will actually be based on a methodology, a technique that is adopted by researchers in geology. So, this lecture series is essentially meant for popularizing this technique and methodology amongst undergraduate, graduate students, researchers and professional geologists in different organizations like geological surveys or other exploration or agencies. And this technique that we will be discussing about is mostly more than about a century and a half old, and it has evolved into a fair level of sophistication and with development of the analytical facilities. So, we will be discussing about the fluid inclusions that we see in minerals. They are tiny objects, but these as it happens in many of the methodologies that we adopt for studying rocks formed under diverse geological settings, we actually mean to address broader problems of broader geological processes, and this particular technique also is helpful in terms of the data that we generate in addressing issues of broader earth processes, several outstanding problems of formation of rocks, crustal evolution, and in particular that has been happening in the geological past. So, we will essentially be describing these tiny objects that we see in different mineral hosts. There could be any mineral that forms in the earth's crust constituting rocks, quartz, calcite, fluorite, apatite, then metamorphic minerals like garnet, cordierite, ore minerals like the sulfides, which can be observed in a different technique. And so, these are the tiny objects that we will be describing and discussing through the series, through this lecture series, and would actually be discussing as to what kind of information we could retrieve from them and in what way. So, essentially this lecture would be having the 4 parts that we have mentioned: its principles, the methodology, the practice, and the applications to different areas of geology. So, now before we go to study these fluid inclusions, we ask ourselves that why do you study fluid inclusions? So, or essentially the why do we so much concerned about fluid? Because we know that the earth's major bulk of a substantial part of the earth is constituting of fluid, and there is fluid on the earth's surface as atmosphere, fluid as in the hydrosphere as rivers and stagnant water, and in shallow groundwater, in deeper groundwater, and even extending up to much greater depths in the mantle. They are responsible in processes of metamorphism, melting, deformation of rocks, and even as very interesting superficial processes as formation of the evaporites, and even sometimes where we also do address the issues of the paleo atmosphere and study fluid inclusions even in ice crystals which formed in the recent geological past. So, the techniques that we employ to study fluids, we could do it by an indirect technique by studying the different minerals in rocks, and then try to indirectly approximate or try to estimate the compositional characteristics of the fluid that were there during the formation of the rocks. And the technique that we will be employing here is essentially the direct method of studying the fluid, the paleofluid, by looking at the inclusions in minerals in rocks which formed in several millions, hundreds or thousands of million years ago in the geological past. So, this is a means by which we can directly sample the fluid that we are interested in. So, then we talk about what principles that we will be essentially be employing. So, here we are more interested in studying the behavior of this fluid or the fluid mixtures, because we know that the fluid that we are talking about dominantly constituting of water, but has substantial amount of dissolved non electrolytes and electrolyte species, and we need to understand the behavior of these complex fluids in different geological conditions where pressure and temperature and other compositional characteristics like fugacity of oxygen, fugacity of sulfur. So, these are the compositional variables which dictate the compositions of the fluid. So, we have to understand the basic we employ very simple principles of chemical thermodynamics or even more specifically the principles of phase rules and the phase behavior of this fluid multi-component multi-phase fluid. And essentially what we do is to understand the pressure, volume, temperature, composition relationships of these complex fluid mixtures and see that how we correlate them to the occurrence of these fluid inclusions in minerals, and when we do some experiments on them, the type of data that we retrieve, how we are going to correlate and how we use them in understanding the broader earth processes. So, the methodology that we employ here is to determine the fluid, what kind of experiments that we do to understand the fluid characteristics and their different thermal and chemical attributes. And so, we do that by observing the response of these tiny inclusions that we see in minerals to heating and freezing experiments, or what we essentially call as microthermometry and microanalysis of these fluid inclusions to understand them, to characterize them, and to see what results we get from them, so that we can apply them to understand broader earth processes. So, when we talk about practice, means the very simple, at the very beginning, that the way they will sample the rock from the field, from any kind of a rock that we are studying, an ore body or a metamorphic rock. So, we discuss about how to prepare the samples and then look at these inclusions under microscope, because they are tiny objects and we need to study them in high magnification in normal polarizing microscopes. Sometimes we use specialized microscopes like infrared microscopes, and even techniques like scanning electron microscope also is used to characterize the fluid inclusions in the totality. And then how to plan and how to organize the experiments like the heating freezing experiments or the microthermometric experiments. Then the data that we generate, how we present the data, how we and then comes the applications that we can apply to the problem that we are addressing. It could be an ore body, how it formed in nature, it could be the metamorphic rock of any particular grade in any crustal segment, how the metamorphism took place or it evolved under different changing conditions of physicochemical conditions, under what conditions the rock deformed. And sometimes we are also interested in the study of the ancient sedimentary basins, the sedimentary environments. Even you can apply this technique to see the hydrocarbon rich fluids in petroliferous basins and the maturation of the organic compounds, and also it is being used in exploration of the for hydrocarbon in petroliferous basins, and also it is used in exploration can be used in exploration for mineral deposits. And as I told, sometimes even we can sample these fluid inclusions in ice crystals which formed several thousands of hundreds of thousands of years ago, and can talk about the changing conditions of the atmosphere. So, that is how it makes an interesting and very exciting technique and methodology that is applied to across almost many disciplines in geology. And I sincerely hope that this outcome of the course will be very helpful and useful to you. Thank you very much.